Hopefully I didn't just destroy your guys' ears. Maybe I did. Okay, hey. So don't mind this. I just copied the Primogen. I just used this police car light for this description of this video. So, we are here. Actually, I'll post this over in a Discord if you want to come watch. Okay. Okay. So, I'm just gonna send this to my friend and I'm gonna get on with this. We're going to get streaming here in 1 second. I'm just literally... I should probably do this before I stream, but I didn't, so you guys are having... If you're just watching this, you can go skip ahead and, I guess, I don't know, go skip ahead in the video if you're from the future. Okay. So, I got interested in HTMX today, so let me just make sure all the stream here is working. Okay, so I got interested in HTMX today, and I've heard a lot of people like the Primogen and stuff talk about it. I'm just genuinely curious about it, and so we are going to dig into it and just see what all the hype is about. There's a book online for free called Hypermedia Systems, and I don't know what this is about. I am going into this completely blind, so we shall see. So, we can read this here. So we get the Hypermedia Systems contents. So there's Hypermedia contents, Hypermedia driven web applications with HTMX, and then that's a big chunk of the book. And then bringing Hypermedia to mobile, and then conclusions. Okay, let's start with introductions. So this is a book about building applications using and actually I'll zoom in here just in case anybody else is going to read this in the future. So this is a book about building applications, and actually, you know what? Am I digging this lo-fi? I want something like chiller. Perfect. So, this is a book about building applications using hypermedia systems. And actually, let me turn this down a little bit more. Okay, so this is a book about building applications using hypermedia systems. Hypermedia systems might seem like a strange phrase. However, hypermedia how is hypermedia a system? Isn't hypermedia just a way of linking documents together, like with HTML on the World Wide Web? What do you mean a hypermedia system? Well, yes, HTML is a hypermedia, but there is more to the way the web works than just HTML. HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, is what transfers HTML from servers to clients, and there are many details and features associated with it: caching, various headers, response codes, and so forth. And then, of course, there are hypermedia servers, which present hypermedia APIs. Yes, APIs to clients all over the network. And finally, there is the all-important hypermedia client, a software client that understands how to render a hypermedia response intelligibly to a human, so that a human can interact with the remote system. The most widely known and used hypermedia clients are, of course, web browsers. Web browsers are perhaps the most sophisticated piece of software that we use. They not only understand HTML, CSS, and many other file formats, but they also provide a JavaScript runtime and programming environment that is so powerful that web developers can create entire applications in it that are nearly as sophisticated as thick clients, that is, native applications. We got a Schmeagle joining us. Get up here, Schmeagle. Okay. This runtime is so powerful, in fact, that today many developers ignore hypermedia features of the browser in favor of building their web applications entirely in JavaScript. Applications built in this manner have come to be called single-page applications. Rather than navigating between pages, these applications use JavaScript for updating the user interface directly. When they communicate with a server, these applications typically use JSON API calls via AJAX, and they often update the user interface using a reactive style of front-end JavaScript library. Okay, so this is like, if you've done React and stuff, then you know exactly what this is. Okay. In these applications, HTML becomes somewhat awkward. Did my music stop? I want it up a little bit more. Ooh, got some guitar. Okay. In these applications, HTML becomes somewhat awkward, a somewhat awkward graphical interface description language that is used because, for historical reasons, that is what happens to be there in the browser. Applications built in this style are not hypermedia driven. They do not take advantage of the underlying hypermedia system of the web. To explain what a hypermedia driven application looks like and to contrast it with the popular SAP application of today, and that's a single page application, we need to first explore the entire hypermedia system of the web, oh no, beyond just discussing HTML. Hold on here. Beyond just discussing HTML. We need to look at the network architecture of the web, including how a web server delivers a hypermedia API and how to effectively use the hypermedia features available in the hypermedia client, i.e. the browser. So it's saying, hey, why don't we learn how to leverage the kind of underlying stuff of HTML? Ooh. This jazz music keeps freaking me out because it keeps changing. What is a hypermedia system? To understand what a hypermedia system is, we'll first just take an in-depth look. Actually, you know what? We're going back to lo-fi. It's like throwing off my brain, and I'm trying to concentrate, but it's just getting like it's in my head. Let's go back to lo-fi here. Okay. What is a hypermedia system? To understand a hypermedia system to understand what a hypermedia system is, we'll first take a look in depth at the canonical hypermedia system, the World Wide Web. Roy Fielding, an engineer who helped create specifications and build the implementations of many early pieces of the web, gave us the term RE presentational state transfer, REST. Yep. In his PhD dissertation, he described REST as a network architecture, and he contrasted it with earlier approaches to building distributed software. We define hypermedia systems as a system that adheres to the RESTful network architecture in Fielding's original sense of the term. I had no idea that that's why. Did you guys know that? Did you know that REST is a representational state transfer and that it was by this guy, Rory Fielding? I did not know that. I know what REST APIs are, but did not know that. So we define hypermedia system as a system that adheres to the RESTful blah blah blah. Unfortunately, today you probably associate the term REST with JSON APIs, since that is where the term is typically used in industry. This is a misapplied use of the term REST because JSON is not a natural hypermedia due to the absence of hypermedia controls. The exchange of hypermedia is an explicit requirement for a system to be considered RESTful. It is a long story how we got here using the term REST so incorrectly, and we will go into the details later in the book. But for now, if you think REST implies JSON, please try to set that understanding aside while reading this book and come to the concept with fresh eyes. Okay, easy. It is important to understand that in his dissertation, Fielding was describing the World Wide Web as it existed in the 1990s. The web at that point was simply a web browser exchanging hypermedia. That system, with its simple links and forms, was what Fielding called RESTful. JSON APIs were a decade away from becoming common tools in web development. REST was about hypermedia and the 1.0 version of the web. So we have hypermedia driven applications. In this book, we're going to take a look at hypermedia as a system architecture and then explore some practical, modern approaches to building web applications using it. We will call applications built in this style hypermedia driven applications, or HDAs, and we contrast them with a popular style in use today, the single page application. So I think React is technically a single page application. I think most web frameworks today are probably single page applications. A hypermedia driven application is an application built on top of a hypermedia system that respects and utilizes the hypermedia functionality of the underlying system. See, this is I feel like I'm gonna have my mind blown by this because what they're kind of saying is like, hey, there's a tremendous amount of stuff under here actually in terms of like utility, and most web applications today, SPAs don't leverage it. Okay, goals. The goal of this book is to give you a strong sense of how the RESTful hypermedia system architecture differs from other client-server systems, and what the strengths and weaknesses of the hypermedia approach are. Further, we hope to convince you that the hypermedia architecture is relevant to developers building modern web applications. We aim to give you the tools to evaluate the requirements for an application and answer the question, could I build this as a hypermedia-driven application? And we hope for many applications the answer will be yes. So the book layout, the book is broken up into 3 parts, an introduction or reintroduction to hypermedia with a particular focus on HTML and HTTP. We will finish this review of core hypermedia concepts by creating a simple Web 1.0 style application, contact.app, for managing contacts. Next, we'll look into how we can use HTMX, a hypermedia-oriented JavaScript library created by the authors of this book, to improve the contact app by using HTMX. We will be able to achieve a level of interactivity in our application that many developers would expect to require a large, sophisticated front-end library such as React. Yeah, so thanks to HTMX, we will be able to do this using hypermedia as our system architecture. Finally, we will look at a completely different hypermedia system, Hyperview. Hyperview is a mobile hypermedia system related to but distinct from the web and created by one of the authors of this book, Adam Stepinski. It supports mobile-specific features by providing not only a mobile-specific hypermedia, but also a mobile hypermedia client. These novel components, combined with an HTTP server, make it possible to build mobile hypermedia-driven applications. Crazy. Okay, I'm here. I want to read. Note that each section of this, I'm sorry. Note that each section is somewhat independent of the other. If you already know Hypermedia in depth and how basic Web 1.0 applications function, you may want to skip ahead to the second section on HTMX and how to build modern web applications using Hypermedia. Similarly, if you are well versed in HTMX and want to dive deep into the novel mobile Hypermedia, you can skip ahead to the Hyperview section. That being said, the book is designed to be read in order, and both the HTMX and Hyperview sections build on the Web 1.0 application described at the end of the first section. Furthermore, even if you are well versed in all the concepts of hypermedia and the details of HTML and HTTP, it is likely worth it to at least skim through the first few chapters for a refresher. So Hypermedia, a new generation. Hypermedia isn't a frequent topic of discussion these days. Even older programmers who grew up with the web in the late 1990s and early 2000s haven't thought much about these ideas in years. Many young web developers have grown up knowing nothing about single-page applications and the frameworks that are used to build them. In particular, many young web developers began their careers by building React.js applications that interact with a Node server using a JSON API. They may never have learned about Hypermedia as a system at all. This is a strange and frankly a failure on the part of the thought leaders in the web development community to properly communicate and advocate for the use of Hypermedia, for the Hypermedia approach rather. Hypermedia was a great idea and it still is. By the end of this book, you will have the tools and language to put this great idea to work in your own applications. And further, you will be able to bring the ideas and concepts of hypermedia systems to the broader web development community. Hypermedia can compete, Hypermedia can win, and Hypermedia has won as an architectural choice against the single-page application approach, but only if smart people like you, I don't know about that, learn about it, build with it, and then tell the world about it. Remember the message. The future is not set. There is no fate, but what we make for ourselves. Man, it's so cool. Terminator reference, Kyle Reese. Okay, so HTML notes Hypermedia in practice. Clearly, HTML plays a central role in the story we tell here. At the end of each chapter, we will share what we have learned about writing HTML for hypermedia-driven web applications. To start, remember that our web applications are not islands. We are writing HTML not just for the particular application, but also to play along with other members of the web. When we write the hypermedia systems we have in mind, we're better able to tap the range of abilities available of the web. HTML is hypermedia friendly when it is written for the full range of HTML is hypermedia friendly when it is written for the full range of constituents of the hypermedia system. It conveys the system of the state of an application to people viewing our site with a browser, as well as how people listening to the screen readers. As well as to people listening to screen readers that read sites aloud. It conveys the aims of our site to search engines that scrape the sites programmatically. It also conveys its behavior as clearly as possible to other developers. No, we can't just fix every problem with good old HTML. The mantra that HTML is accessible by default is misleading. We would miss out on important opportunities if we shunned other technologies like JavaScript, and we still need to test a lot everywhere to ensure things work as expected. But HTML lets browsers do a lot of the work for us. Okay, Hypermedia, a reintroduction. So chapter 1, Hypermedia, a reintroduction. Contents. Hypermedia is a universal technology today, almost as common as electricity. Billions of people use hypermedia-based systems every day, mainly by interacting with hypertext markup languages. With the hypertext markup language, otherwise known as HTML, being exchanged via the Hypertext Transfer Protocol (HTTP) by using a web browser connected to the World Wide Web. People use these systems to get their news, check on their friends, and buy things online, play games, send emails, and so forth. The variety of sheer number of online services being delivered by Hypermedia is truly astonishing. And yet, despite this ubiquity, good vocabulary, the topic of hypermedia itself is a strangely underexplored concept today, left mainly to specialists. Yes, you can find a lot of tutorials on how to author HTML, create links and forms, etc., but it is rare to see a discussion of HTML as a hypermedia and, more broadly, on how an entire hypermedia system fits together. This is in contrast with the early web development era when concepts like representational state transfer, REST, and hypermedia as the engine of the application, Hateos, Hateos, EOS. Ah, man, I can't even pronounce that. Hypermedia as the engine of application state were discussed frequently, redefined, and debated among the web developers. See, this is really interesting because one of my big fascinations is like state management with applications. And this is almost saying that like hypermedia would represent state. I'm very curious now. In a sad turn of events, today, the world's most popular hypermedia, HTML, is often viewed resentfully. It is an awkward legacy markup language that must be grudgingly used to build user interfaces in what are increasingly entirely JavaScript-based web applications. HTML happens to be there, in the browser, and so we have to use it. And I'll be 100% honest, that's how I kind of feel about HTML. Like, in general, I guess I do have that kind of bias myself, if I'm being real. Like, I don't know. I guess you're talking about me. Oops, no, we lost our spot. This is a shame, and we hope to convince you that hypermedia is not simply a piece of legacy technology that we have to accept and deal with. Instead, we aim to show you that hypermedia is a tremendously innovative, simple, and flexible way to build robust applications, hypermedia-driven applications. We hope that by the end of this book, you will feel, as we do, that the hypermedia approach deserves a seat at the table when you, a web developer, are considering the architecture of your next application. Creating a hypermedia-driven web application on top of a hypermedia system like the web is a viable and indeed often excellent choice for modern web applications. And as the section on Hyperview will show, not just web applications. Interesting. What is hypermedia? So hypertext, new forms of writing appearing on computer screens that will branch or perform at the reader's command. A hypertext is a non-sequential piece of writing, only the computer display makes it practical. Ted Nelson. Let us begin at the beginning. What is hypermedia? So hypermedia is a media, for example, a text, that includes, non-linear branching from one location in the media to another, via, for example, hyperlinks embedded in the media. The prefix hyper, derived from the Greek prefix, I don't know. I can see, let's see, I don't know what the first thing is. I know the second one's pi, then it's epsilon. P, I think that's theta? I don't know. Means beyond or over, indicating that hypermedia goes beyond normal passively consumed media like magazines and newspapers. Hyperlinks are a canonical example of what is called a hypermedia control. Hypermedia control. A hypermedia control is an element. Oops, man, I gotta stop clicking on this. So, hypermedia control. A hypermedia control is an element in a hypermedia that describes or controls some sort of interaction, often with a remote server, by encoding information about the interaction directly and completely within itself. I'm going to read that again. Hypermedia control. A hypermedia control is an element in a hypermedia that describes or controls some sort of interaction, often with a remote server, by encoding information about that interaction directly and completely within itself. Okay? Hypermedia controls are what differentiate hypermedia from other sorts of media. You may be more familiar with the term hypertext from those Wikipedia pages that, from whose Wikipedia page the above quote is taken. Hypertext is a subcategory of hypermedia, and much of this book is going to discuss how to build modern applications using hypertext, such as HTML, the Hypertext Markup Language, or HXML, a hypertext used by the Hyperview mobile hypermedia system. Man, they like to say hyper a lot. Okay, hypertext. Hypertext, like HTML, function alongside other technologies crucial for making an entire hypermedia system work. Network protocols like HTTP, other media types such as images and videos, hypermedia servers, i.e. servers providing hypermedia APIs, sophisticated hypermedia clients, e.g. web browsers, and so on. Because of this, we prefer the broader term hypermedia systems when describing the underlying architecture of an application built using hypertext, to emphasize the system architecture over the particular hypermedia being used. Okay, so that's why they're not just saying like, HTML or something. Hypermedia system is including the entire scope, with because HTML is literally just the HTML, and the entire hypermedia system is the videos and the images and the server and the browser, so all that stuff. It is entirely it is the entire hypermedia system architecture that is unappreciated and ignored by many modern web developers. Okay, a brief history of hypermedia. Where did the idea of hypermedia come from? While there were many precursors to the modern idea of hypertext and the more general hypermedia, many people point to the 1945 article, As We May Think, written by Vannevar Bush in The Atlantic, as a starting point for looking at what was to become modern hypermedia. In this article, Bush describes a device called a memex, that's funny, which, using a complex mechanical system of reels and microfilm, along with an encoding system, would allow users to jump between related frames of content. The memex was never actually implemented, but it was an inspiration for later work on the idea of hypermedia. The term hypertext and hypermedia were coined in 1963 by Ted Nelson, who would go on to work on the hypertext editing system at Brown University, and who later created the file retrieval and editing system, a shockingly advanced hypermedia system for its time. This was perhaps the first digital system to have a notion of undo. While Nelson was working on his ideas, Douglas Engelbart was busy at work at the Stanford Research Institute, explicitly attempting to make Vannevar Bush's memex into reality. In 1968, Engelbart, it's not Engelbart, Engelbart gave the Mother of All Demos in San Francisco, California. Man, uh, Engelbart demonstrated an unbelievable amount of technology. So here are the things. So remote collaborative text editing with his peers in Menlo Park, video and audio chat, an integrated windowing system with window resizing, etc., a recognizable hypertext whereby clicking on underlined text navigated to new content. So imagine how crazy it would be is like you're a dude in 1968 and you're watching like I mean the first implementation of any kind of like browser technology of all time. Despite receiving a standing ovation from a shocked audience after his talk, it was decades before the technologies. So he didn't. Aw. It was a decade before the technologies Engelbart demonstrated became mainstream. Yeah, well, it is now. Modern implementation. In the 1990s, Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, published the first website. He had been working on the idea of hypertext for decades and had finally, out of desperation at the fact it was so hard for researchers to share their research, found the right moment and inspirational support to create the World Wide Web. Creating the web was really an act of desperation, because the situation without it was very difficult when I was working at CERN later. Most of the technology involved in the web, like hypertext, like the internet, uh, multi-font text objects, had all been designed already. I had just put them together. It was a step of generalizing, going to a higher level of abstraction, thinking about all the documentation systems out there as being possibly part of a larger imaginary documentary system. That's crazy. By 1994, his creation was taking off so quickly that Berners-Lee founded the W3C, a working group of companies and researchers tasked with improving the web. All standards created by the W3C were royalty-free and could be adopted and implemented by anyone, cementing the open, collaborative nature of the web. By the 2000s, Roy Fielding, then at UC Irvine, published a seminal PhD dissertation on the web, architectural styles and the design of network-based software architecture. Fielding had been working on the open source Apache HTTP server, and his thesis was a description of what he felt was a new and distinct networking architecture that had emerged in the early web. Fielding had worked on the initial HTTP specifications and in the paper defined the web's hypermedia network model using the term REST, so representational straight transfer. Man, in 2000, that's crazy. Fielding worked. I'm sorry. And if I keep mispronouncing, guys, I'm tired and I've been looking at screens all day. But I'm actually like genuinely curious at this point. So, Fielding's work became a major touchstone for early web developers, giving them a language to discuss the new technical media they were building applications in. We will discuss Fielding's key ideas in depth in Chapter 2, and try to correct the record with respect to REST, Hatios, Hatios and Hypermedia. The world's most successful hypertext, HTML. At the beginning was the hyperlink, and the hyperlink was with the web, and the hyperlink was the web, and it was good. That's funny. It's like a Bible like meme quote. That's funny. Okay. The system that Berners-Lee, Fielding, and many others had created revolved around a hypermedia, HTML. HTML started as a read-only hypermedia used to publish, at first, academic documents. These documents were linked together via anchor tags, which created hyperlinks between them, allowing the users to quickly navigate between documents. When HTML 2.0 was released, it introduced the notion of the form tag, joining the anchor tag like the hyperlink. as a second hypermedia control. So I know what a hyperlink is, but I know what a form tag is. Okay. The introduction of the form tag made building applications on the web viable by providing a mechanism for updating resources rather than just reading them. It was at this point that the web transitioned from an interesting document-oriented system to a compelling application architecture. Today, HTML is the most widely used hypermedia in existence, and this book naturally assumes that the reader has reasonable familiarity with it. I do. You do not need to be an HTML or CSS expert to understand the code in this book, but the better you understand the core tags and concepts of HTML, the more you'll get out of it. The essence of HTML as hypermedia. So let us consider these two defining hypermedia elements. That is, the two defining hypermedia controls of HTML, the anchor tag and the form tag. And so I think anchor tag is just like I'm pretty sure anchor is just like a link in a bit of detail. So the anchor tags. Anchor tags are so familiar as to be boring, but the original hypermedia control, it is worth as the original hypermedia control, it is worth reviewing the mechanics of hyperlinks to get our minds in the right place for developing a deeper understanding of hypermedia. Consider a simple anchor tag embedded within a larger HTML document. So here you got, A, and it just has a reference to it, HTTP, and then it's pointing to Hypermedia Systems folder. Okay. An anchor tag constitutes of the tag itself, so A and A, as well as, and I actually didn't know, that makes complete sense, why when you make a link, right, you don't actually, you don't say link, you say A. As well, I feel like I did know that a long time ago, but I forgot. Okay. An anchor tag consists of the tag itself, AA, as well as the attributes and content within the tag. Of particular interest is the href attribute, which specifies the hypertext reference to another document or document fragment. It is this attribute that makes the anchor tag a hypermedia control. A typical web browser with an anchor tag would be interpreted to mean show the text hypermedia system in a manner indicating that it is clickable. So that's that. When the user clicks on the text, issue a HTTP GET request to the URL there, and then take the HTML content in the body of the HTTP response to this request and replace the entire screen in the browser as a new document, updating the navigation bar to this new URL. The anchor provides the main mechanism we use to navigate around the web today, by selecting links to navigating from document to document or from resource to resource. Here is what a user interaction with an anchor tag / hyperlink looks like in visual form. Okay, so you're on the browser, Laura ipsum dolor. You click on this link here, it sends an HTTP request to the server, talks to the browser, and then it sends that back to the browser. And then it says, hey, that's your response. When the link is clicked, the browser, or as we sometimes refer to it, the hypermedia client, initiates an HTTP GET request to the URL encoded in the link's href attribute. Note that the HTTP request includes additional data, metadata, on what exactly the browser wants from the server, in the form of headers. We will discuss these headers and HTTP in more depth in Chapter 2. The Hypermedia server then responds to this request with a Hypermedia response, the HTML, for the new page. This may seem like a small and obvious point, but it is an absolutely crucial aspect of a truly RESTful hypermedia system. The client and the server must communicate via hypermedia. Okay, so they talk across hypermedia as well. So, yeah. So like the response of the text is like the new text. Gotcha. I think I knew that. form tags. Anchor tags. Do I even like this music? It's alright. I'm really looking for something, what's this music here? Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so anchor tags, blah blah blah. So form tags. So anchor tags provide navigation between documents or resources, but don't allow you to update these resources. It's a little too loud. There we go. This is a little bit better. So anchor tags provide navigation between documents or resources, but don't allow you to update those resources. That functionally falls to the form tag. So here's a simple example of a form in HTML. So form, action, signup, method post, input type, text, name, email, placeholder, enter email to sign up, button sign up. Like an anchor tag, a form tag consists of the tag itself, form, combined with the attributes and the content within the tag. I'm gonna set my dog down. He's getting a little bit heavy. Come here, Schmeagle. Sit down in your bed. There you go, buddy. Note that the form tag does not have an href attribute, but rather has an action attribute that specifies where to issue an HTTP request. Okay, so it has the action okay, so it gives an action. Furthermore, it also has a method attribute which specifies exactly which HTTP method to use. In this example, the form is asking the browser to issue a post request. Okay. In contrast with an anchor tags, I cannot talk. In contrast with anchor tags, the content and tags within a form can have an effect on hypermedia interactions that the form makes with the server. The values of input tags and other tags, such as select tags, will be included with the HTTP request when the form is submitted, as URL parameters in the case of a GET and as part of the request body in case of a POST. This allows a form to include an arbitrary amount of information collected from a user in a request, unlike the anchor tag. Okay, so I want to read this a little bit. Let's break that down. So in contrast to anchor tags, the content and tags within a form can have an effect on the hypermedia interaction that the form makes with the server. So, okay, so that makes sense. So, whereas the anchor is just, it's saying, hey, it says, hey server, give me back some HTML at this new link. Whereas the anchor or form tag can actually, it can pass information to the server. So that's the big difference. So an anchor tag cannot pass information to the server, but a form tag can. So a form tag can talk to the server, or it can pass information to the server. It can pass context to the server. So in contrast with anchor tags, the content and tags within a form can have an effect on the hypermedia interaction that the form makes with the server. The value of the input tags and other tags such as select tags will be included in the HTTP request when the form is submitted as URL parameters in case of a GET and as part of the request body in the case of a POST. Got you. This allows a form to include an arbitrary amount of information collected from the users in a request, unlike the anchor tag. In a typical browser, this input and sign up button, so this is really cool. I didn't know that the two fundamental, I knew a link was one of the fundamental parts of HTML. I didn't realize how kind of badass form is, and how form is the original way of actually passing content back to the server. That's kind of ridiculous. I did not know any of this. This is really interesting. Where were we? We were a little bit further down. We were right here. Yeah, so we would just pass this. In a typical browser, this form tag and its contents would be interpreted by the browser roughly as follows. So if you get a form tag and you're the browser, your job is to show a text input and a sign up button to the user. So if we look at the text here, sign up button, and it's also an input field that says enter email to sign up. Gotcha. Then your next job as the browser is when the user submits the form by clicking the sign up button or by hitting the enter key while the input element is focused, issue an HTTP post request to the path sign up on the current server. Okay. Then take the HTML contents in the body of the HTTP response body and replace the entire screen in the browser as a new document, updating the navigation bar to the with this URL. That's like, I mean, I know it sounds basic. I know it sounds like really simple, but like, imagine how like we just take it for granted that somebody already figured all this out for us. This mechanism allows the user to issue requests to update the state of resources on the server. Note that despite this new type of request, the communication between the client and server is still done entirely within Hypermedia. Okay, so this mechanism allows the user to issue the requests to update the state of resources on the server. Note that despite this new type of request, the communication between client and server is still done entirely with Hypermedia. That is true. So it's, you know, it's only doing, I'm gonna turn on the music a little bit. So everything is just through Hypermedia. It is the form tag that makes Hypermedia driven applications possible. If you are an experienced web developer, you probably recognize that we are omitting a few details and complications here. For example, the response to a form submission often redirects the client to a different URL. This is true, and we'll get down into the muck with forms in more detail in a later chapter, but for now, this simple example suffices to demonstrate the core mechanism for updating the system state purely within Hypermedia. Here's a diagram. So you have a browser, you have the sign up and the sign up input field and the button. When you click that, you make an HTTP request that says, hey, post to sign up on the current server. It goes ahead and posts that information. It hits the HTTP server, and the HTTP sends back a response, and it sends back a text response, and the body of that is going to be our new page. Web 1.0 applications. As someone interested in web development, the above diagram and discussion are probably very familiar to you. You may even find this content boring. I think it's interesting. I'm just a little bit tired, but I do think it's interesting. But take a step back and consider the fact that these two Hypermedia controls, anchors and forms, are the only native ways for a user to interact with a server in plain HTML. Only two tags. That is kind of insane. And yet, armed with only these two tags, the early web was able to grow exponentially and offer a staggeringly large amount of online dynamic functionality to billions of people. This is strong evidence of the power of Hypermedia. Even today, in a web development world increasingly dominated by large JavaScript-centric front-end frameworks, many people choose to use simple vanilla HTML to achieve their application goals and are often perfectly happy with the results. These two tags give a tremendous amount of expressive power to HTML. So what isn't Hypermedia? So links and forms are the two main Hypermedia-based mechanisms for interacting with a server available in HTML. Now let's consider a different approach. Let's interact with a server by issuing an HTTP request via JavaScript. To do this, we will use the Fetch API, a popular API for issuing an asynchronous JavaScript and XML or AJAX request, available in all modern web browsers. So you could say on click, fetch me this. So first on click, you fetch this, so you issue the request, then you convert the response to a JSON object, and then you invoke update UI on that data that you get back. So this button has an on-click attribute that specifies some JavaScript to run when the button is clicked. This okay, I think I see the point they're trying to make. The JavaScript will issue an AJAX HTTP GET request to the API v1 contacts1 file path using a fetch. An AJAX request is like a normal HTTP request, but it is issued behind the scenes by the browser. The user does not see a request indicator from the browser as they would with normal links and forms. Additionally, unlike requests issued by those Hypermedia controls, it is up to the JavaScript code to handle the response from the server. Despite AJAX having XML as part of its acronym, today the HTTP response to this request would almost certainly be done in JavaScript object notation, or JSON, format rather than XML. So they're saying, hey, so that's interesting. So despite AJAX literally specifying XML as part of its acronym, today you would use JSON. Okay, that makes sense. I've done this before. An HTTP response to this request might look something like this. So this would be the JSON, and that makes sense. So because the only thing you're sending back is text, right, the JSON you send back is going to get digested by your browser. So you'd get something like this, the start of the JSON object, a property, in this case with the name ID and the value of 42, another property, the email of contact with this ID. So the JavaScript code above converts the JSON text received from the server into a JavaScript object by calling the JSON method on it. This new JavaScript object is then handed off to the update UI method. The update UI method is responsible for updating the UI based on the data encoded in JavaScript in the JavaScript object, perhaps by displaying the contact in a bit of HTML in the JavaScript application. The details of exactly what the update UI function does are not important for us right now. What is important is the crucial aspect of this JSON-based server interaction is that it is not using Hypermedia. The JSON API being used here does not return a Hypermedia response. There are no hyperlinks or other Hypermedia style controls on it. This JSON API rather is a data API. So that's actually a really good point. So did you guys see how, like, when it gets back to you, instead of being given what you're going to show, you are actually given the data, and then your JavaScript will interpret that data and convert it to HTML and show it back, and then it'll show it to the user. So because the response is in JSON and not Hypermedia, the JavaScript update UI method must understand how to turn its contact data into HTML. In particular, the code in update UI needs to know about the internal structure and meaning of the data. It needs to know exactly how the fields in the JSON data object are structured and named, how they relate to one another, how to update the local data this new data corresponds with, how to render this data in the browser, and what additional actions / API endpoints can be called with this data. In short, the logic in update UI needs to have intimate knowledge of the API endpoint at the API tag here, knowledge provided via some side channel beyond the response itself. As a result, the update UI code and the API have a strong relationship, known as tightly coupling. If the format of the JSON response changes, then the code for update UI will almost certainly need to be changed as well. That's a really good point. That's actually a really good point. I see what they're getting at. They're saying, hey, when you use JavaScript and you send off that data and it comes back to you as JSON, you then are responsible. So like when it comes back as HTML, you as the programmer are not responsible for what happens next. You just display the body of that, and the server told you what change. Like the server, which is you're hitting an API and you're getting back stuff, it sends you back it already finished. Like what you're going to display is already finished. But if you do it the JavaScript route in this, like with update UI in this example, then you are responsible for converting it the last leg of the step, like the steps of the conversion. Which, if the API changes, would break your code, and you'd have to rewrite it on your side as well. I see what they're getting at here. This is cool. Single-page applications. This bit of JavaScript, while very modest, is an organic beginning of a much larger conceptual approach to building web applications. This is the beginning of a single-page application, an SPA. The web application is no longer navigating between pages using hyperlink controls, as was the case with links and forms. Instead, the application is exchanging plain data with the server and then updating the contents within a single page. When this strategy or architecture is adopted for an entire application, everything happens on a single page, and thus the application becomes a single page application. The single-page application architecture is extremely popular today and has been the dominant approach to building web applications for the last decade. This can be observed by the high level of mind share and discussions it has received in industry. Today, the vast majority of single-page applications adopt far more sophisticated frameworks for managing their user interface than this simple example shows. Popular libraries such as React, Angular, Vue.js, etc. are now the common, indeed the standard way to build web applications. With these more complex frameworks, developers typically work with an elaborate client-side model, that is, with JavaScript objects stored locally in the browser's memory that represent the model or domain of your application. These JavaScript objects are updated via JavaScript code, and the framework then reacts to these changes, updating the user interface. When the user interface is updated by a user, these changes also flow into the model objects, establishing a two-way binding mechanism. The model can update the UI, and the UI can update the model. Yep. This is a much more sophisticated approach to a web client than Hypermedia, and it typically does away almost entirely with the underlying Hypermedia infrastructure available in the browser. HTML is used to build user interfaces, but the hypermedia aspect of the two hypermedia controls, anchors and forms, are unused. Neither tags interact with a server via the native hypermedia mechanisms. Rather, they become user interface elements that drive local interactions with the in-memory domain model via JavaScript. This is really fascinating. This is kind of blowing my mind. Which is then, because like, and just for a pause, for like a timeout, I think I can see what they're getting at. It's like, think about the amount of bloat you're kind of dealing with here then. Like, think of the amount of bloat. Now, I don't know if that bloat's always bad, and there are probably certain cases where you really do need what's running on the browser to be larger and larger and larger. But I think what they're going to try to get at with HTMX is like, hey, for a lot of applications, why not let the server send you back what to render, and basically like do your state management on the server, and don't leave the state management to the client. I think that's what it is. It's like server side, because there's the term like server side rendering, and what that kind of means, right, is like on the server I don't know if that technically is that technically rendering? Is creating the HTML rendering, or is I don't know. I don't know. This is very interesting though. Rather, they become user interface elements that derive local interactions with the in-memory domain model via JavaScript. Yeah. Which is then synchronized with the server using plain data JSON APIs. Yeah. So you're basically not using the hypermedia at all. You're just using JSON as between you and the server, and then you're taking in that data, processing it, doing something with it, and then updating your UI. So, as with our simple button above, the single page application approach forgoes the hypermedia architecture. It leaves aside the advantages of the existing RESTful architecture of the web and the built-in functionality found in HTML's native hypermedia controls in favor of JavaScript-driven behavior. Single-page applications are much more like thick client applications, that is, like the client-server applications of the 1980s, an architecture popular before the web came along, and that the web was in many ways a reaction to. This approach isn't necessarily wrong, of course. There are times when a thick client approach is the appropriate choice for an application, but it is worth thinking about why web developers so frequently make this choice without considering other alternatives, and if there are reasons not to go down this path. So why use hypermedia? The emerging norm for web developers is to build a React single-page application with server-side rendering. Okay, maybe my I thought servers okay, I thought server-side rendering was when you rendered on the server, but maybe I'm not understanding this. The emerging norm for web developers is to build a React single-page application, yeah, with server rendering. The two key elements of this architecture are something like the main UI is built and updated via JavaScript using React or something similar, and the backend is an API that 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 application makes requests against. That is grammatically correct there. That the backend API is an API that makes an application or the backend is an API that no, that is wrong. The backend is an API that application makes requests against. The idea it has really swept the internet. It started with a few major popular websites and has crept into corners like Mercury sites and blogs. Tom McWright. Okay. The JavaScript-based single-page application approach has taken the web development world by storm. And if there was one single reason for its wild success, it was this. The single-page application offers a far more interactive and immersive experience than old, gronky Web 1.0 hypermedia-based applications could. SPA had the ability to smoothly update elements in line on a page without dramatic reload of the entire document, and they had the ability to use CSS transitions to create very nice visual effects and the ability to hook into arbitrary events like mouse movements. All of these abilities gave JavaScript-based applications a huge advantage in building a sophisticated user experience. Given the popularity and power and success of this modern approach to building web applications, why on earth would you consider an older, clunkier, and less popular approach than like Hypermedia? So JavaScript fatigue. We're glad you asked. It turns out that the Hypermedia architecture, even in its original Web 1.0 form, has a number of advantages when compared to a single-page application plus JSON data API approach. Three of the biggest are an extremely simple approach to building web applications. It is extremely tolerant of content and API changes. In fact, it thrives on them. It leverages tried and true features of web browsers such as caching. The first two advantages in particular address a major pain point in modern web development. Single-page application infrastructure has become extremely complex, often requiring an entire team to manage. JSON API churn. Constant changes made to JSON APIs to support application needs has become a major pain point for many application teams. Oh, my music stopped. Come on, music. Don't die. Please. Please. Okay, my music has just died here, apparently. Hold on. Come on, man. Come on, man. I want my music. There we go. So the first two advantages in particular address the major pain points. Yeah, so this is like really kind of true. The combination of these two problems, along with other issues such as JavaScript library churn, has led to a phenomenon known as JavaScript fatigue. This refers to a general sense of exhaustion with all the hoops that are necessary to jump through to get anything done in a modern day web application. We believe that a hypermedia architecture can help cure JavaScript fatigue for many developers and teams. But if Hypermedia is so great, and if it addresses so many of the problems that beset the web development industry, why was it set aside in the first place? After all, Hypermedia was there first. Why didn't web developers just stick with it? There are two major reasons Hypermedia hasn't made a comeback in web development. The first is this. The expressiveness of HTML as a hypermedia hasn't changed much, as if at all, since HTML 2.0, which was released in the mid-90s. Many new features have been added to HTML, of course, but there haven't been any major new ways to interact with the server in HTML in almost 3 decades. HTML developers still only have anchor tags and forms available as hypermedia controls, and those hypermedia controls can still only issue GET and POST requests. This baffling lack of progress by HTML leads immediately to the second and perhaps most practical reason that HTML as hypermedia has fallen on hard times. It is the interactivity and expressiveness of HTML that remained frozen, and the demands of web users have continued to increase, calling for more and more interactive web applications. JavaScript-based applications coupled with data-oriented JSON APIs have stepped in as a way to provide these more sophisticated user interfaces. It was the user experience that you could achieve in JavaScript, and that you couldn't achieve it in plain HTML, that drove the web development community to JavaScript-based single-page web applications. The shift was not driven by any inherent superiority of the single-page application as a system architecture. It didn't have to be this way. There's nothing intrinsic to the idea of hypermedia that prevents it from having a richer, more expressive interactivity model than vanilla HTML. Rather than moving away from the hypermedia-based approach, the industry could have demanded more interactivity from HTML. Instead of building thick client applications within web browsers, building thick client-style applications within web browsers became the standard, in an understandable move to a more familiar model for building applications. And this is like some great freaking lore on HTML. I'm actually really enjoying this. So not everyone set aside hypermedia, of course. There have been heroic efforts to continue to advance hypermedia outside of HTML, like efforts like HighTime, Voice XML, and HAL. But HTML, the most widely used hypermedia in the world, stopped making progress as a hypermedia. The web development world moved on, solving the interactivity problems with HTML by adopting JavaScript-based SPAs and mostly inadvertently a completely different system architecture. A hypermedia resurgence? Question mark. It is interesting to think about how HTML could have advanced. Instead of stalling as a hypermedia, how could HTML have continued to develop? Could it have kept adding new hypermedia controls and increasing the expressiveness of the existing ones? Would it have been possible to build modern web applications within this original hypermedia oriented and RESTful model that made the early web so powerful, so flexible, and so much fun? This might seem like an idle speculation, but we have some good news on this score. In the last decade, a few idiosyncratic alternative front end libraries have arisen that attempt to get HTML moving again. Ironically, these libraries are written in JavaScript, the technology that supplants HTML as the center of web development. However, these libraries use JavaScript not as a replacement for the fundamentals of the hypermedia web system of the web. Instead, they use JavaScript to augment HTML itself as a hypermedia. These hypermedia-oriented libraries recenter hypermedia as the core technology in web applications. So hypermedia-oriented JavaScript libraries. In the web development world, there is an ongoing debate between the single-page application approach and what is now being called the multi-page application approach. Multi-page is a modern name for an old Web 1.0 way of building web applications using links and forms located on multiple web pages, submitting HTTP requests and getting HTML responses. MPA applications by their nature are hypermedia-driven applications. After all, they are exactly what Roy Fielding was describing in his dissertation. These applications tend to be clunky, but they work reasonably well. Many web developers and teams choose to accept the limitations of plain HTML in the interest of simplicity and reliability. Rich Harris, a creator of Svelte.js, a popular SPA library, and thought leader on the SPA side of the debate, has proposed a mix of this older MPA style and the newer SPA style. Harris calls this approach to building web applications transitional, in that it attempts to blend the MPA approach and the newer SPA approach into a coherent whole. This is somewhat similar to the transitional trends in the architecture, which combines traditional and modern architectural styles. Transitional is a fitting term for a mixed style approach, and it offers a reasonable compromise between the two approaches, using either one as appropriate on a case-by-case basis. But this compromise still feels unsatisfactory. Recall that the crux of the trade-off between SPA and MPAs is the user experience, or the interactivity of the application. This typically drives the decision to choose one approach versus the other from an application, or, in the case of a transitional application, for a particular feature. It turns out that by adopting a hypermedia-oriented library, the interactivity gap between MPA and SPA closes dramatically. So it turns out that by adopting a hypermedia-oriented library, the interactivity gap between MPA and SPA approach closes dramatically. You can use the MPA approach, that is, the hypermedia approach, for much more of your application without compromising your user interface. You might even be able to use hypermedia approach for all of your application needs. Rather than having an SPA with a bit of hypermedia around the edges, or some mix of the two approaches, you can often create web applications that is primarily or entirely hypermedia driven, and this satisfies the interactivity that your user requires. This can tremendously simplify your web application and produce a much more coherent and understandable piece of software. While there are still times and places for those more complex SPA approaches, which we will discuss later in this book. By adopting a hypermedia first approach and using a hypermedia oriented library to push HTML as far as possible, your web application can be powerful, interactive, and simple. One such hypermedia-oriented library is HTMX. HTMX will be the focus of part 2 of this book. We will show you can, in fact, create many common modern UI features found in sophisticated single-page applications by instead using the hypermedia model. Huh. Ooh, I'm popping my back. When building a web application with HTMX, the term multi-page application applies roughly, but it doesn't fully characterize the core of the application architecture. As you will see, HTMX doesn't need to replace entire pages, and in fact, an HTMX-based application can reside entirely within a single page. We don't recommend this practice, but it is possible. So it isn't quite right to call web applications built in HTMX multi-page web applications. What the older Web 1.0 MPA approach and the newer hypermedia-oriented library-powered applications have in common is their use of hypermedia as the core technology and architecture. Therefore, we use the term hypermedia-driven applications, HDAs, to describe both. This clarifies that the core distinction between these two approaches and the SPA approach isn't the number of pages in the application, but rather the underlying system architecture. Hypermedia-driven web application. A web application that uses hypermedia and hypermedia exchanges as its primary mechanism for communicating with a server. So what does an HDA look like? Let's look at an HTMX-powered implementation of the simple JavaScript-powered button above. So apparently this is the HTMX button that they made up here. So if you remember, the JavaScript button, which was all the way up here, was this big old complicated thing. And then if we go down, go way down. This is what it condenses down to. So button, hx get, target, contact UI, fetch contact. Oh. As with the JavaScript powered button, this button has been annotated with some attributes. However, in this case, we do not have any explicit JavaScript scripting. Instead, we have declarative attributes much like the href attribute on anchor tags and the action attribute of form tags. The hxGet attribute tells HTMX when the user clicks this button, issue a GET request to contacts1. The hxTarget attribute tells HTMX when the response returns, take the resulting HTML and place it into the element with the ID contact UI. Here we get the crux of HTMX and how it allows you to build hypermedia-driven applications. The HTTP response from the server is expected to be in HTML format, not JSON. The HTTP response to this HTMX-driven request might look something like this. So it literally just gives you back the raw HTML. This small bit of HTML would be placed into the element in the DOM with the ID contact UI. Thus, this HTMX-powered button is exchanging hypermedia with the server, just like the anchor tag or form tag might, and thus the interaction is still using the basic hypermedia model of the web. HTMX is adding functionality to this button via JavaScript, but what functionally is augmenting HTML as a hypermedia. So you're preserving the fact that what's going across the wire to you in the server is a hypermedia medium, or it's a hypermedium. HTMX extends the hypermedium or media system of the web rather than replacing the Hypermedia system with a totally different architecture. Despite looking superficially similar to one another, it turns out that this HTMX powered button and the JavaScript based button are using extremely different system architectures and thus approaches to web development. As we walk through building a hypermedia driven application in this book, the difference between the two approaches will become more and more apparent. When should you use hypermedia? So hypermedia is often thought, though not always, a great choice for web application. Perhaps you are building a website or application that simply doesn't need a huge amount of user interactivity. There are many useful web applications like this, and there is no shame in it. Applications like Amazon, eBay, or any number of news sites, shopping sites, messaging boards, and so on don't need a massive amount of interactivity to be effective. They are mainly text and images, which is exactly what the web was designed for. Perhaps your application adds most of its value on the server side, by coordinating users or by applying sophisticated data analysis and then presenting it to the user. Perhaps your application adds value by simply sitting in front of a well-designed database with simple create and read, update and delete CRUD operations. Again, there is no shame in this. In any of these cases, using a hypermedia approach would likely be a great choice. The interactivity needed for these applications are not dramatic, and much of the value of these applications lives on the server side rather than the client side. All of these applications are amenable to what Roy Fielding called large grain hypermedia data transfers. You can simply use anchor tags and forms with responses that return entire HTML documents when requests to do, and things will work just fine. This is exactly what the web was designed to do. By adopting the hypermedia-driven approach for these applications, you will save yourself a huge amount of client-side complexity that comes with adopting a single-page application approach. There is no need for client-side routing, for managing a client-side model, for wiring JavaScript logic, and so forth. The back button will work just works. Deep linking will just work. You will be able to focus your efforts on your server where your application is actually adding value. And by layering HTMX or other hypermedia-oriented libraries on top of this approach, you can address many of the usability issues that come with vanilla HTML and take advantage of finer-grained hypermedia transfers. This opens up the whole slew of new user interfaces and experience possibilities, making the set of applications that can be built using hypermedia much larger. But more on that later. This is kind of crazy. I can see what the idea is. What do you think, Schminkle? This is interesting. We'll finish reading this chapter, Schminkle, and then we're probably going to call it a night because I have been coding a lot today. So, when you shouldn't use hypermedia. So what about the not always? When isn't hypermedia going to work well for applications? One example that springs to mind immediately is an online spreadsheet application. In this case, a spreadsheet updating one cell could have a large number of cascading changes that needs to be made across the entire sheet. Worse, this might need to happen on every keystroke. In this case, we have a highly dynamic user interface without clear boundaries as to what might need to be I can't talk. In this case, we have a dynamic user interface without clear boundaries as to what need to be updated given a particular change. Introducing a hypermedia style server round trip on every cell exchange could hurt performance tremendously. This is simply not a situation amenable to the large grain hypermedia data transfer approach of the web. For an application like this, we would certainly recommend looking into a sophisticated client-side JavaScript approach. However, even in the case of an online spreadsheet, there's Likewise, areas where the Hypermedia approach might also help. The spreadsheet application likely also has a settings page, and perhaps that settings page is amenable to the Hypermedia approach. If it is simply a set of relatively straightforward forms that needs to be persist on the server, the chances are good that Hypermedia would in fact work great for this part of the app. And by adopting Hypermedia for that part of your application, you might be able to simplify that part of your application quite a bit. You could then save more of your application complexity budget for the core, complicated spreadsheet logic, keeping the simple stuff simple. Why waste all the complexity associated with heavy JavaScript frameworks on something as simple as a settings page? A complexity budget. Any software project has a complexity budget, explicit or not. There is only so much complexity a given development team can tolerate, and every new feature and implementation choice adds at least a bit more of overall complexity to the system. What is particularly nasty about complexity is that it tends to grow exponentially. One day you can keep the entire system in your head and understand the ramifications of a particular change, and a week later the whole system seems intractable. Even worse, efforts to help control complexity, such as introducing abstraction or infrastructure to manage the complexity, often end up making things even more complex. Truly, the job of a good software engineer is to keep the complexity under control. The surefire way to keep complexity down is also the hardest, to say no. Pushing back on feature requests is an art, and if you can learn it to do it well, making people feel like when they say no, you will. If you can learn to do it well, making people feel like they said no, you will go far. Sadly, this is not always possible. Some features will need to be built. At this point, the question becomes, what is the simplest thing that could possibly work? Understanding the possibilities available in the Hypermedia-driven approach will give you another tool in your simplest tool chest. This is very interesting. I can see their point. I can absolutely see their point. Hypermedia, a sophisticated modern system architecture. Hypermedia is often regarded as an old and antiquated technology in web development circles, useful perhaps for static websites, but clearly not a realistic choice for modern sophisticated web applications. Seriously, are we claiming that modern web applications can be built using it? Yes, seriously. Contrary to the current popular opinion, Hypermedia is an innovative and modern system architecture for building applications, in some ways more modern than the prevailing single-page application approach. In the remainder of this book, we will reintroduce you to the core practical concepts of Hypermedia and then demonstrate exactly how you can take advantage of the system architecture in your own software. In the coming chapters, you will develop a firm understanding of all the benefits and techniques enabled by this approach. We hope that, in addition, you will also become as passionate about it as we are. Woo. HTML notes. Div soup. The best known kinds of messy HTML is div soup. When developers fall back on the generic div and span elements, when developers fall back on the generic div and span elements instead of more meaningful tags, we either degrade the quality of our websites or create more work for ourselves, probably both. For example, instead of adding a button using the dedicated button element, a div element might have a click event listener added to it. There are two main issues with this button. This is not focusable. The tab key won't get you to it. There is no way for an assistive tool to tell you that it's a button. Yes, we can fix that by adding the role button and the tab index that. These are easy fixes, but they're things you have to remember. They're also not obvious from the HTML source that this is a button, making the source harder to read and the absence of these attributes harder to spot. The source code of pages with div soup is difficult to edit and debug. To avoid div soup become friendly with HTML specs of the available tags, and consider each tag another tool in your tool chest. There might be things there you don't remember from before. With 113 elements currently defined in the spec, it's more of a tool shed. Of course, not every UI pattern has a designated HTML element. We often need to compose elements and arguments augment them with attributes. Before you do, though, rummage through the HTML tool chest. Sometimes you might be surprised how much is available. Okay, we're on to chapter 2. But this is awesome. I'm really enjoying this. Um, and I'm kind of curious to see how, this is going to become, how this can integrate with F# is really what I'm kind of excited to see. So we did introduction and hypermedia and a reintroduction. All right. Well, I am going to stop there. I am very tired, but it's been awesome streaming, and it looks like a couple people stuck around and watched some stuff, so that's great. So anyways, I'm hopping off, everybody, and I really do want to finish this, though, so I'm probably going to have some other videos like this, and we'll just break this up in chunks and just read through this. So thanks, everybody, and Schmeagle, stop. Bye.